a difficult challenge, and we are going to begin with a perspective from New Zealand. Invite Reverend Phil King to begin. From New Zealand, Reverend King has been the Global Mission Director for the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand since 2012. In this role, he leads the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand in supporting partner churches in mission, particular focus on Vanuatu and Myanmar. He values the partnership which his church shares with the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan. Prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, ecumenical youth exchange were taking place with the PCT, and he hopes these can be reestablished when the borders reopen. The PCANZ is a member of the Council for World Mission, and Reverend King has recently been appointed one of CWM's independent trustees. Phil, I think we've warm greetings. We've been briefed on the time, and I won't take more of your time as we invite you to help us move deeply into our theme today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me? Good. Ko te ahu mairangi te monga, ko wai karori te awa, no te whanganui atara ahau, ko PCANZ Global Mission aku mahi, ko King toko whānau, ko Phil toko ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I bring you greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and thank you for this invitation to address the Taiwan Ecumenical Forum. In my greeting, I told you my mountain, my river, where I live, my work, and my family. And that's an important part of New Zealand culture as we introduce each other with our mihi in the indigenous language of New Zealand, the Maori language. I would like to begin by thanking Dr. Lai for yesterday's presentation, and also Rod Hewitt and Nancy Pittman for their responses. Rod's observation about the Caribbean will resurface today as I speak about the Pacific region, and I echo Nancy's comments in making the point that I'm not an expert in geopolitics, but I speak as one with an interest in and deep concern for developments in the Asia Pacific. I was asked to speak from the national perspective of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and so I'll begin my presentation with an overview of New Zealand's approach to foreign policy, and then consider the various factors that impact on this. These include the economic importance of trade with China, the rising geopolitics in the Pacific, and the increasing tension between China and Taiwan. A brief summary will conclude that New Zealand's foreign policy is principled but constrained by economic interests. In her speech to New Zealand's diplomatic corps on Waitangi Day this year, Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta outlined New Zealand's foreign policy values. Ms. Mahuta is our first Indigenous Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I think doing an excellent job. These foreign policy values are based on Maori language. These are manaki, goodness, or the reciprocity of goodwill; whānauanga, which means our connectedness or shared sense of humanity; mahitahi, or kotahitanga, which is the collective benefit and shared aspiration; and kaitiaki, which is protectorship and stewardship of our intergenerational well-being. So these are the foreign policy values that New Zealand has. Of our approach to foreign policy, she went on to say, New Zealand will be a predictable and reliable partner. You will see New Zealand applying the values that reflect who we are as a nation. These include the way we consider international development assistance as a means to be a responsible neighbour, to offer help when needed, and act as a strategic partner to co-invest and build long-term resilience in partner countries. It also means that as we champion human rights, we seek to extend our advocacy towards sustainable and inclusive outcomes in trade, inclusive and transparent democracy, ethical investment, and social cohesion. With our values as a compass, we will work through international organizations towards goals that we have long championed. These include a commitment to human rights, democracy, the international rule of law, and nuclear disarmament, and to tackle inequality and injustice through our development program and our advocacy. These are values that, as a New Zealand citizen and as one who is influenced by the Judeo-Christian ethic, I am proud of. But it's complicated. The challenge for New Zealand is how well we can give full expression to these values in the complex world of geopolitics. Earlier this year, New Zealand and China signed an upgrade to their bilateral free trade agreement, with two-way trade between the two nations now worth $32 billion. As its largest trading partner, New Zealand is heavily reliant on China economically and has limited bargaining power in that relationship. So the New Zealand government is cautious when speaking out on any issues that might upset this economic arrangement. A good example of this is seen in a speech our Prime Minister made, Jacinda Ardern, in a speech she made in July in New Zealand this year on New Zealand's role in the Indo-Pacific region. New Zealand has been a late adopter of this term, Indo-Pacific, and in using the term, Ms. Ardern was clearly aligning New Zealand with its traditional Western allies. However, she also made a point of saying that the term Indo-Pacific was often used to exclude some nations from dialogue, meaning China, and that she would not use that phrase as a subtext for exclusion. This is a good example of the delicate dance. New Zealand needs to stay on side with its allies without upsetting China to the point that it affects the trade relationship. Former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark recently observed that increasing tensions are making it difficult for New Zealand not to choose a side in the geopolitical arena, where the United States is our main military ally and China our main trading partner. She said New Zealand's distinctive values are the following: human rights, freedom of expression, democracy, and the rule of law. But that despite holding these values, it's not possible to only engage in trade with those who share our values. So she said the question is, how do we develop a relationship with China that is respectful enough both ways and where hard messages can still be delivered? She said it's more complicated now because we're dealing with a much more assertive China than 20 years ago when she was Prime Minister. She made particular mention of the China's wolf warrior diplomats, who are an obvious feature of Chinese diplomacy now. This is an aggressive and often abrasive stance adopted by its diplomats, and according to one of Beijing's most outspoken ambassadors, is simply justified defense against attacks by a West determined to contain it. But this approach creates fear, and other countries are fearful of China, which is not a good basis on which to build respect. But Ms. Clark said there are new attempts, on the other hand, to reinvigorate Western alliances, for example, the Five Eyes and the Orcas agreements. The Five Eyes agreement has gone from being behind-the-scenes alliance to a place where positions are shaped, and Helen Clark says that's a huge threat to New Zealand foreign policy. New Zealand has stood out against this and been criticised for being the weak link in the Anglophone chain. But according to Ms. Clark, the Five Eyes agreement is being used in ways that are very unhelpful to us. New Zealand stands for a peaceful, inclusive, sustainably developing Pacific, and actions outside of this are a threat to that policy stance. In yesterday's presentation, Dr. Lai referred to China's mode of operation called Detract Diplomacy, where dependent nations are saddled with debt, increasing China's leverage. This is a major problem in the Pacific. At a recent conference on international development with a strong focus on the Pacific, Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown addressed this, saying that COVID-19 has escalated the geopolitical interests in the Pacific. New foreign entities seeking to provide support to Pacific Island nations have exacerbated fundamental cleavages in the delivery of aid. He warned there is a collision course between Pacific Islands' development needs and the rapidly evolving state of its bilateral relationships. He said donor-driven approaches to aid seldom address the needs of the recipient, particularly if the agenda is driven by geopolitics. Here I refer back to Rod Hewitt's comment about the Caribbean islands dilemma, which is echoed in the Pacific. These small island nations are vulnerable and threatened. They're subjected to this question, whose side are you on? And no matter which way they turn, they lose. This is well illustrated in the following reflections. At the same conference, New Zealand Foreign Affairs diplomat Mark Ramsden described what he termed deteriorating geopolitical tensions in the Pacific, in the Asia Pacific, especially in Melanesia, where it's re-emerged in a new form. For example, the Solomon Islands switched their diplomatic allegiance from Taiwan to China in 2019, following an earlier move by Kiribati. These decisions by the Solomons and Kiribati were for economic reasons, as they have no political power. They're part of China's continuing efforts in the region to marginalize Taiwan. And this has caused division within the Solomons. Province of Malaita, with a population of 200,000, is very pro-Taiwan, and their premier is using this as a reason to foment political concerns. So the riots that you're seeing on TV and you're hearing about have this the China-Taiwan issue as the genesis, but actually there's something much deeper as well. This is contributing to instability within the Solomons. So an example of this occurred in the past 2 weeks with an outbreak of anti-government protests in the Solomons' capital, Honiara. Protests turned extremely violent and destructive, with arson and looting taking place, and with some fatalities. The Australian government reacted quickly, sending in police and diplomats to help restore order. It was reported that some observers argue Australia acted quickly to avoid Chinese security forces stepping in. New Zealand also responded to a request for help from the Solomons government and sent some troops. Observers note this cannot only be characterized as a disagreement over the Solomons' China policy. Their internal divisions are more deep-seated and complicated than that. But this is an example of what Dr. Lai referred to yesterday as China-related, if not China-initiated. Tensions in the Pacific are very much against what New Zealand is seeking to build resilience and stability in the Pacific Island. This kind of destabilization plays into China's hands. Mark Ramsden said that the geopolitical tensions in the Pacific raise fundamental questions for New Zealand about the kind of societies we imagine for the region. New Zealand values democracy. It's what we believe in and want. But there are competing models of what societies look like. And while New Zealand has named some very important values, there's been a softly approach, while China's influence has continued to grow. In an article in one of our online newspapers in November the 4th, New Zealand political journalist Lucy Kramer drew attention to the increasing tensions in the Taiwan Strait and made the point that Taiwan might be more than 9,000 kilometres from New Zealand, but what happens there matters to us. Conflict there would have massive implications for New Zealand's involvement and also massive implications for peace and stability in the region. So far, our government has been cautious on China's increasing aggression, although in October it was part of a large military flotilla that sailed through the South China Sea in a show of force. And our foreign minister did mention her concerns in a speech a few weeks ago. But New Zealand's policies in the past 50 years has seen them siding politically with China. In 1971, they supported China rather than Taiwan and having a seat at the United Nations. And in 1972, the New Zealand Labour Party established diplomatic relations with the Communist government of China. And it acknowledged but did not officially recognise that Taiwan was a part of China's territory. However, New Zealand has continued to have economic and cultural ties with Taiwan. We have a trade and industry office in Taipei, and we signed a comprehensive trade treaty with Taiwan in 2013. So there's much interaction despite the lack of formal recognition. And Taiwan is our 9th largest trading market. But when New Zealand recognised Taiwan, it had to agree not to recognise, when it recognised China, it had to agree not to recognise Taiwan. And so treads a fine line. Any change to that policy would lead to a strong reaction from China. New Zealand needs to be deeply concerned about conflict with Taiwan. A Chinese takeover would have serious implications for the Pacific. Having control of Taiwan would allow China easier naval and submarine access into the Pacific. They have already supported the development of naval ports in at least one Pacific nation, Vanuatu. An invasion of Taiwan would result in war on a scale that would touch New Zealand's interests. There's also danger of escalation between nuclear powers, which would further destabilise the region. With New Zealand's principles-based foreign policy, it would be difficult to ignore the invasion of a country with a democratic, peaceful, law-based population the same size as Australia. And it would increase the spread of authoritarianism. A free, democratic Taiwan remains an example to the rest of China that democracy can work in Chinese society. One of our academics, Catherine Churchman of the Asian Studies Department at Victoria University, said, "We don't want the authoritarian regime of the People's Republic of China spreading further out of China and remodelling other countries." So in summary, New Zealand's foreign policy values are principled and clearly articulated. But it could be argued that economic realities constrain New Zealand's full expression of those values. If we were to make a stand on Taiwan, trade sanctions from China would be crippling. Similarly, if we were to make a stand over West Papuan human rights in Indonesia, there would be economic consequences. So our government is maintaining a consistent but cautious stance within the delicate world of geopolitics. Foreign Minister Naya Mahuta followed up the position she set out in her Waitangi Day speech during her visit to Indonesia in November, when she warned of rising nationalism in the Indo-Pacific. Her speech condemning military rule in Myanmar and China, and China's claim over the South China Sea, was directed at ASEAN, whose Secretary General she met during her tour. Ms. Mahuta emphasised again, we need regional architecture that promotes a rules-based approach that protects human rights, emphasises open markets, and safeguards the sovereignty of all states regardless of their size. Unsurprisingly, China responded with a warning shot across the bow. Last weekend, China's representative in New Zealand warned our government not to get too involved in matters beyond their remit. China's Deputy Chief of Mission and current Chargé d'Affaires in New Zealand said China is worried that New Zealand is increasingly speaking out about China's actions in the South China Sea, attributing this tougher stance to pressure from the US and Australia. He said New Zealand is undergoing some pressure from outside and tried to have more voice on the South China Sea. We feel worried about that, and we don't know the reason, he said. He blamed this on New Zealand's need to remain close to the US and Australia and said, if we, that is China, have any information on trade policy or economic policy, the New Zealand government will be very interested. But on South China Sea issue or Xinjiang issue, we explain a lot to them, but they don't want to listen. Maybe they feel the pressure from outside or have some difference on values. This is surely a thinly veiled warning to New Zealand to be careful, or there'll be consequences that could hurt us. So New Zealand has a clearly articulated and principled position, but because of our economic reliance on China, it feels as though the trade relationships are too important for the government to assert itself too strongly. However, if the geopolitical tensions continue to rise, which they seemingly will, this will put increasing pressure on New Zealand's position. For all of the above reasons, strong voices raised in defence of Taiwan's sovereignty and advocating for their self-determination are not likely to come from our government, but from an educated public, our academics, journalists, and members of our community who are aware of the issues at stake, hence the importance of forums like this.